A caller lit up the operations center at Al Udeid before dawn, and the watch officer who answered later said the voice on the line was calm in a way that felt wrong. The way silence feels wrong right before something breaks. The message was short. It came from Tehran, and it was not a request. Inside the command tent, the air was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and cable heat. Screens threw pale light across the faces of officers who had not slept in 18 hours. On one wall, a chart tracked the position of a carrier strike group built around the USS Abraham Lincoln, its icon crawling slowly across a stretch of water that had, in the space of one news cycle, become the most dangerous patch of ocean on the planet. An analyst pointed at the strait. Someone else asked the question everyone in that room was already chewing on. If the choke point closes, how long before the pressure becomes something nobody can walk back? Nobody answered right away. Word had come in that Iranian leadership was signaling defiance rather than retreat, and the Pentagon's assessment, read aloud in a flat voice by a briefing officer, was that Tehran no longer believed it had anything left to lose by escalating. 300 miles east, near the coast, a merchant tanker changed course sharply, its captain reporting on open radio that he had seen fast boats shadowing him for the better part of an hour. Whether that was surveillance or something worse was still being argued in the tent when the next report came in. A missile strike had hit near the Emirati coast. The target was a tanker moving through waters that, until recently, had been treated as safe passage even amid the wider unrest. The UAE's foreign ministry issued a sharply worded protest within the hour, and in Washington, officials scrambled to figure out whether this was an isolated provocation or the opening move in a wider campaign meant to squeeze every partner in the Gulf at once. Back in the command tent, a young captain slid a folder across the table. "Sanctions," he said, "fresh ones, aimed at 7 individuals and the networks moving money and equipment for Iran's Revolutionary Guard. A shipping firm here, a travel outfit there, a cryptocurrency exchange registered out of the Emirates that investigators believed had been laundering funds for months. The Treasury Department had also posted a reward, $15 million, for anyone willing to hand over details on how that financial network actually worked. Someone in the corner muttered that $15 million was a strange number to put on information nobody expected to get. The strait itself remained the center of gravity. Iranian officials, through state media, insisted that reopening it depended entirely on Washington meeting a short list of conditions, unfreezing billions in Iranian assets held overseas, and lifting the blockade the United States had imposed around the waterway. It was a demand that put the American administration in an uncomfortable spot, because every day the strait stayed shut, global shipping insurers raised their rates, and every day those rates climbed, the political pressure back home grew louder. A staffer who had been quietly watching cable news feeds looked up and said the surveys were already ugly, that a majority of the public wanted this over, one way or another, and that a president facing re-election next year could not afford to be seen dragging the country deeper into a war with no clear finish line. That comment hung in the room for a moment. Nobody in that tent needed reminding what happened to leaders who made the wrong call on a war of choice. Then a message came in from the fleet. Aboard the strike group, the mood was different from the command tent's controlled tension, sharper, more physical. Sailors on the flight deck worked under floodlights, moving ordnance between aircraft with the practiced economy of people who had done this drill more times than they wanted to count. A flight deck chief, 26 years old, originally from a small town in Ohio, later described the moment a general quarters alarm sounded as the loudest silence he had ever heard, because for 3 full seconds nobody moved, and then everybody moved at once. It turned out to be a false alarm, a radar contact that resolved into a commercial aircraft off its filed route. But the 3 seconds stayed with people. One petty officer said afterward that she thought about her daughter back in San Diego during that pause. Not because she believed she was about to die, but because some part of her brain apparently decided that was the moment to check. Command had ordered the strike group to maintain distance from the strait's narrowest point, close enough to project reach, far enough to avoid becoming the story that started something nobody could stop. That balance was the entire war in miniature. Presence without provocation, strength without triggering the exact outcome everyone in Washington was trying to prevent. Analysts in the tent kept circling back to one detail that unsettled them more than the missile strikes themselves. Iran's proxies, the ones operating along the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and across the wider region, appeared to be moving with a coordination that suggested centralized direction rather than local improvisation. One officer put it plainly: you don't get that kind of synchronized pressure campaign from groups acting independently, not when the funding and the intelligence appear to trace back to the same source. There was also quiet acknowledgement, never stated for the official record, but present in every side conversation, that intelligence services on more than one side had assets embedded deep inside these networks. It was the reason several in the room believed that Iran's senior military leadership had suffered such precise losses earlier in the conflict. Every hour, every movement had apparently been known to someone before it happened. And if that kind of penetration existed on one side, there was no particular reason to assume it did not exist on the other, feeding the instability rather than calming it, because a war that ends quickly serves nobody who profits from it continuing. A comms officer read out the latest line from Tehran's foreign ministry, that a deal was close, that a maritime framework was nearly finished, but that Washington would still owe compensation for what officials described as violations committed during the conflict. The number attached to that claim was $300 billion, a figure that made even the most composed people in the tent raise their eyebrows, since the fund it referenced had originally been meant to be split among several Gulf states, with the United States never agreeing to contribute a share in the first place. And just as that framework seemed to be edging towards something workable, a new strike hit a tanker in Qatari waters, a nation that had been quietly serving as the mediator, holding the whole fragile process together. 14 points of a near-finished agreement collapsed within hours. Whoever ordered that strike, if it came from Tehran, had just detonated its own negotiating position along with the ship. Back in Washington, a senior defense official, speaking on condition of anonymity because the assessment had not been publicly cleared, said the strategic weapon Iran actually possessed in this fight was not nuclear. It was geography. Close, a narrow strip of water, barely 20 miles across at its tightest point, and you didn't need warheads to bring the global economy to its knees. That comment stuck with people in the room the way a hard truth sometimes does, quietly and then all at once. Meanwhile, halfway around the world, an entirely different kind of story was breaking, one that had nothing to do with missiles and everything to do with trust. Indian authorities confirmed that a wing commander in the Indian Air Force, 44 years old, had been arrested back in the spring on charges under the Official Secrets Act. The allegation, according to officials who spoke to reporters, was that the officer had been contacted through a social media account traced to Pakistan, that a relationship developed over months during what was described only as a difficult period in his personal life, and that the conversation eventually moved to video calls, through which sensitive information was allegedly extracted piece by piece. A second allegation surfaced alongside the first, that the officer had also accessed a colleague's phone to retrieve additional material. Pakistan, for its part, had made no public statement on any of it, and the story had barely registered in domestic reporting there, even as it dominated Indian headlines for days. Sitting with a paper cup of cold coffee, one veteran counterintelligence officer in the operations center remarked that these cases always land the same way in public conversation, half outrage and half disbelief, because it is hard for people to accept that someone trained for years to guard state secrets can still be undone by something as ordinary as loneliness. He wondered aloud whether anyone in that position is ever really trained for that kind of vulnerability, or whether the training only covers the parts of the job that look like war and leaves the rest of a person exposed. Nobody had a clean answer. It was the kind of question that follows you out of the room. As the night shift changed over in the command tent, the strategic picture had not resolved into anything close to certainty. The strike group remained on station, its position updated on the wall chart one more time before the outgoing watch handed off to the incoming one. The strait was still closed. The tanker strikes continued in scattered, unpredictable bursts. The sanctions list had grown by 7 names and 1 exchange. and somewhere between Tehran's demand for compensation and Washington's demand for de-escalation, the actual shooting had not stopped. It had simply paused long enough for both sides to calculate what happens next. One young ensign, finishing her first deployment on the strike group, said in a letter home that she had stopped trying to predict when this would end and had started instead just trying to make sure everyone on her section came home the same way they left. It was a smaller ambition than winning a war, she wrote, but it was the only one that felt like it was actually hers to keep. Whether that quiet, private version of victory counts for as much as the ones drawn on the wall charts back at command is not a question anyone in that tent or on that flight deck seemed ready to answer.